And now our last speaker is Dr. Gary Turner, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at York. You're seeing a theme here. Everyone's at York. And he is a registered clinical neuropsychologist in the province of Ontario. Gary's program of research investigates how age-related brain changes impact cognitive and real-world functioning, including financial decision-making, both in normal aging and brain disease. A core objective of Gary's work is to leverage neuroscience discoveries to guide the design of more effective interventions towards sustaining cognitive and brain health, ultimately helping older adults live healthier longer. Take it away, Gary.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to RCI Science for the invitation, and thank you to all of you for joining. So I think this has been a great session so far. As Dale mentioned, what we have covered here, I think with Dr. Wilkinson or Fran covered perception. You had a really beautiful talk from Dr. Stevens or Dale. I'm going to refer to him as Dale and Fran going forward, but so Dale's talk took us up from perception up to cognition. And I'm going to, as Dale mentioned, I'm going to kind of take us more out into the real world, where I'm going to draw on some of this earlier work and bring it together and talk about something that is happening in our everyday lives. And what that's going to be is financial exploitation and aging. And I called it surveillance to intervention. And that effectively is my roadmap. So I don't have a roadmap for you. I'm going to talk about surveillance in the first part of the talk. And then I'm going to talk about intervention toward the end, kind of some of the directions that we're going to take on the intervention side of things. And you'll see as we go forward, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to kind of take numerous ingredients from cognition. I'm going to talk about social functioning, and I'm going to talk about the brain. And we've heard a lot about the brain already, but I'm going to talk about some of our own work in the brain that looks at how these all come together to alter financial exploitation risk in older adulthood. So that's my roadmap. It's essentially surveillance to intervention. I am going to start with my collaborators and funders on this work. So I always do this because I typically go over time and then I rush through this, but this is such an important part. None of what we do is ever on our own. So I'm working with an amazing team of collaborators, Nathan Sprang at McGill University, Natalie Ebner, who's at the University of Florida, and Bonnie Levin, who's at the University of Miami. And also a big thank you to the funders from our institutions, our universities, as well as the funding agencies, as you see listed here. So thank you to them, and you'll hear these names come up again as I go through the talk today. So what I'm going to do to start off, I want to talk about the scope of the problem. And so I think most people in the audience have become aware of the perils of financial exploitation, and that includes scams and frauds and whatnot. And I'll talk a little bit more about types of financial exploitation in a few moments. But even when I started this work about 5 or 6 years ago, it was already being described as a public health crisis or a virtual epidemic, as you see kind of the quotation I put up there. It was being written about in popular media. You probably see it's only growing from then. And back at that time, and even going back maybe a decade, the estimates were that 1 in 5 adults over the age of 65 are falling victim to some type of exploitation or fraud. So we're at about a 20% level. And that's costing. That comes with enormous costs. So I put $2 billion there, which was an estimate. Again, it might be about a decade ago now. So that's certainly grown over the last decade. But that's likely a severe underestimate of the problem. And the reason why is that these are typically self-report. So what we're doing is actually asking people, have they been victims of fraud? And I think we could all probably get the sense that if someone's going to ask you that, you may or may not be willing to share that you were the victim of fraud. So we believe, and I think the field in general believes, that this is still an underestimate of the true prevalence of the problem. I also think this is going to get much bigger and has gotten much bigger as a problem. And the reason why is really twofold. So one is that we've all heard of the baby boomers. We're all part of the baby boomers. We're kind of on one end or the other. So if the baby boom generation is moving through in terms of getting older, and we know this in North America and Canada and the US, there's a huge cohort of adults who are moving into older adulthood. What you probably don't think about as much, and certainly this is not universally true, but as a cohort, they're the wealthiest generation in human history. So you can begin to start to think, well, if they're the wealthiest generation in human history, then perhaps you might think of them as a bigger target for fraudsters or people who are willing to perpetrate financial crimes. So that's one reason why I think this problem is growing. The other reason is that the avenues for financial exploitation are broadening. And if you think back, and we go back to kind of say the middle of the 20th century, in the 1950s, for example, or 60s, probably the chances of financial exploitation or fraud were more or less limited to the salesperson who came up to your door and tried to sell you something you didn't want, a vacuum cleaner, a subscription, something like that. Now, of course, if we fast forward, we probably all received the phone call from the CRA, from the revenue agency that says you owe us money or what have you. So we've all gotten those phone calls. So that's another avenue of financial exploitation. The third, and obviously, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, is the third biggest avenue now, or an emerging avenue, maybe even the biggest, is online. So more older adults are living their lives online, as we all are. Everyone is living their lives, especially now in these pandemic times. Everyone's living their life online, kind of what we're doing right at the moment. So you may think, or there is an unfortunate stereotype that older adults are not living their lives as much online. I can tell you flat out that is not true. So we have data from a cohort in Montreal where we asked them how much they're spending time online. Fully 97% of older adults, average age 75, thereabout, 97% of them are doing activities online, whether it's social media, whether it's email and whatnot. So the stereotype of the older adult being afraid of technology and not going online is not true. So now you can start to see that there's another avenue for financial exploitation that's emerging. And we're starting to do some work in this domain. I'll talk about that toward the end of the talk today. So I hope I convinced you that this is becoming and has been and is growing into what was described earlier. There's a public health crisis and perhaps even a virtual epidemic. So now I want to move into the exploitation risk factors. So remember, our goal here is surveillance. So if we're doing surveillance, we want to identify those older adults who are at greater risk of exploitation, so that then we can kind of begin to think, we can start to think about more targeted intervention measures that I'm going to talk about at the end of the talk today. But think about surveillance. In order to surveil properly, we have to know what is going on, what is leaving some older adults more vulnerable than others to financial exploitation. So I'm going to go through some of these here, but before I do that, I want to talk again about another possible stereotype. So I want to be careful here. And so the stereotype is that of an older adult who is the stereotype is all older adults are vulnerable to financial exploitation. That is fundamentally not true. So, and that's not the point of our research here. So I want to kind of combat that stereotype right up front. So I certainly don't want to promote that stereotype. There are amazing older adults who are doing making incredible financial decisions and so on and so forth. The goal of our research program here is to identify those older adults who may be at higher risk than others for financial exploitation. So I want to kind of address that. So everything I talk about in the talk is about differentiating older adults and identifying or doing surveillance so that we can identify those who are at higher risk than others. So I'm not making the statement that older adults are all, as a cohort, vulnerable to exploitation. Okay, so what might be some of the risk factors? If we're going out to surveil and figure out who is at higher risk, what do we want to look at? So Dale, I was going to say Dr. Stevens, but Dale just gave us a really beautiful overview about cognitive changes that occur. And he drew out the two distinctions that I always make also. There are some processing skills that are relevant for decision-making, financial decision-making, that decline. Their processing speed, episodic memory, some of the other factors that Dale walked you through. And those absolutely will interfere or compromise ability to make good financial decisions. But, and I've highlighted here, greater life experience may also help in this regard. So just as Dale was saying, the story is not all negative, we do know that older adults gain a larger repertoire of skills and experience that can help them compensate for the processing abilities that may decline with age. So I think that's an important and positive and nuanced way of thinking about late life development. And so you got to think about it as some things decline, but remember, life experience is increasing. And there's some beautiful research now that suggests that older adults can indeed bring their life experience to bear to make better financial decisions in some contexts than even younger adults. So this is a big one, and we all know why, living in COVID times. We believe that social isolation, and there's some good evidence now from our work and others, that social isolation is exacerbating exploitation risk, financial exploitation risk. And I won't go into this in detail. This is work that's ongoing in our laboratory, particularly around COVID. We're collecting data over the COVID period. But how I'm going to frame this is that the best financial decisions, particularly the big life financial decisions, are made with the consultation of people around you, people who you trust, family members, friends, people who are in your circle. And so when you're isolated from those people, it increases your exploitation risk. I think that's something that we all have to consider, particularly in these times. This is a really interesting facet of changes that occur in normal aging. Remember, just like Dale and Fran, I'm speaking about normal aging here. There is an increased trusting behavior as we age. And so there's been also some beautiful work that's come out in the last couple of years that have talked about older adults are more naturally trusting, and they have more difficulty than younger adults in distinguishing trustful from untrustful behaviors and to learning to make that distinction. And in one recent study, it was particularly fascinating because older adults actually demonstrated rated financial advisors trustworthy, even though the financial advisor had actually broken their trust. So Dale mentioned something about fast, flexible decision-making or fast, flexible cognition. In this case, this is social cognition, but it seems to be that older adults were showing limited flexibility in shifting their trusting behaviors or their trusting judgment, even though the person had demonstrated untrustful behaviors. The last one I'm going to talk about here in terms of trying to understand what might be happening that increases exploitation risk with age is this idea of reduced sensitivity and arousal to negative cues, something we call in the literature a positivity bias with age. And to put simply, what that means is when an older adult compared to a younger adult is about to make a decision, we all do this. We all weigh the potential risks and the potential benefits of that decision. It appears that older adults overweight the positive possible outcomes, the benefit, and underweight the negative potential benefit. So there's a shift in the weightings that, as you can see, if you think about that for a moment, that would increase risk of exploitation because older adults tend to see the future through a more positive lens and tend to downweight the potential negative outcomes. Again, this is research. I'm not saying this applies to everyone at all times, but this is a general trend that occurs with normal aging. Now, let me put this into a model for you, because remember, our whole idea is developing a surveillance to really surveil to identify who's at higher risk of exploitation. So you'll see we've got the cognitive factors here. This has been very well studied in the literature. We know fluid cognition declines. I just walked you through that. I do think there is a benefit from crystallized cognition, the knowledge and experience. And so the mix here on the cognitive side of the equation can lead to reduced financial management capacity, maybe less optimal decision making in a financial context. You can also have some fairly straightforward challenges that arise. Things like numericity, things like being able to work your way through a financial allocation or asset mix, for example. So all of these I'm going to throw onto the cognitive side of our model that lead to greater financial exploitation risk. What we believe is perhaps the most important, and I've already walked you through some of these, is the social factors. And I want you all to start to think about this, because the field has approached financial exploitation risk through the cognitive side of the equation, which makes sense. I mean, we talked about this already today. I think it's not that surprising. What has been missed by and large are these social factors, things like social appraisal, judging if someone may be deceptive, judging if someone is trustworthy, the idea of being more isolated as you age, not having access to trusted confidence to help you make decisions. And then finally, I haven't talked a lot about this, but in older age, there is a general increase in empathic responding. So if someone is actually trying to sell you something, your friendly bank manager, your friendly investment advisor, older adults will tend to have more empathically based responses. And that is great. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think you can stand back and see that if the intentions of the investment advisor are less than honorable, then this empathic responding may actually get you into a little bit of trouble. So we're bringing this over and saying that the social factors actually increase vulnerability to fraud. And I put interpersonal, if you look at the box from the gray arrow on the right, I put interpersonal and impersonal because we believe it affects both. And remember what I said off the top is that by and large, actually, maybe I didn't say this, but I'm going to repeat it here, and I'll say it here now, is that most of the fraud that occurs in financial exploitation occurs between people who know each other. So someone in your circle, a family member, maybe a caregiver, maybe, as I said, the friendly bank manager, what have you. Most financial exploitation occurs between people who know each other or with a known other, is how we phrase it. So we believe these social factors come into play in a very big way in those contexts. So, and each of that leads to financial exploitation risk. So there's one piece that I'm missing that I promised I would talk about when we were mentioning our surveillance. So this is all about surveilling, identifying who is at greatest risk. And those are the age-related brain changes. And Gail walked you through that. Again, it was a beautiful description of what happened in the brain as we age. And what we have done in our own laboratory, in my laboratory, I'm working with Dr. Sprang, or Nathan Sprang, is we ran a study that, and I'll tell you about it before I show you the data. About 4 years ago, we recruited a group of older adults who had experienced financial exploitation. And we recruited a matching group, a control group of older adults who had been exposed to an exploitation event, but had avoided the exploitation. So one group was exploited and one group was not exploited. And we were very interested in seeing, is there something at the level of the brain that might be different, that might differentiate these two groups? And now I'm going to show you the data. So what you see here, it's a very simple image. This is a brain. It's the cortex of the brain. And the front of the brain is over to the right. And then the back of the brain is over to the left. And I think, again, Dale has done a great job in describing the structure of the brain. And we are going to talk about structure here. So we did look at brain function, just as Dale was doing in his studies. Here I'm going to tell you about structure. So this is cortical thickness and how thick the cortex is across the cortex. And we compared both of our groups, the exploited group and the non-exploited group. And we identified differences in the brains of the financially exploited older adults. And these are the areas in yellow here. I want to highlight this area in particular. This is the anterior insula of the brain. As with all brain regions, they do many things. So the anterior insula does many things. But one of the things that we know it is involved in is giving you a sense of your internal body states. So what is going on in your inside, that gut feeling. In other venues where I presented this talk, I described it as the spidey senses. That feeling of, something might be going wrong here. There's something not right. This region of the brain, the anterior insula, is involved in decoding and processing that feeling. And I kind of colloquially here call it the feeling of risk. And so in those group of adults that have been exploited versus those that avoided exploitation, we actually saw a difference in this region. So it really fits with our model of that cognitive changes, social changes, underlying brain changes that are actually having an impact on whether older adults are falling victim to exploitation versus avoiding exploitation. So this is my last slide, and I'm going to talk about where we come. So I said my roadmap is surveillance and intervention. So that was our surveillance part. We're looking at what's going on cognitively. We're looking at what's going on in social functioning. We're looking at what's going on at the level of the brain. And we're bringing all that together to do risk profiling. And that, as I mentioned here, is to uncover comprehensive vulnerability profiles. And why do we do that? We do that so we can develop targeted interventions to help those who are at greatest risk avoid exploitation. And then one of the things that we're doing, and this is early days, but one of the things that we're able to do based on these risk profiles and then target those who are at greatest risk is something we call on-the-spot warning. And that's developing a tool, and this would be particularly for online or email scamming, and we call the tool Merlin. That's why you see a picture of Merlin there. And that tool is effectively something that a piece of software, you can think of it as kind of like your virus protection software. In your virus protection software, what you have is it warns you that there's a potential virus. Here, what we're hoping to do is to warn older adults who are at higher risk, heightened risk for exploitation, that something in the email is deceptive. So we're identifying categories of deceptive cues, and then as soon as that's detected, the software will alert the person who's reading the email. And that's really important, and I'll tell you why that's important. We are running a study, we call it in the wild, so to speak. So we're running it with older adults in their everyday lives. And what we do is we recruit them in, and unbeknownst to them, we send them spam emails over the course of about a month. And in our early data collection, and these spam emails include a link that they can click. In the real world, this would actually be a bad thing to do. In our research study, it's harmless. However, in our early data, 40% of older adults, where we sent those emails out to them, have clicked on the link. That's 40%. 4 in 10 people have clicked on a link that would have infected their computers, for example. So we think this idea of on-the-spot warning is becoming increasingly urgent and important, and it's something that we're kind of building based on all of our surveillance work. So I am over time, as I knew I would be, but I'm going to end here, and I'm going to thank you again for your attention.